Hey guys, I'm Dov, and today I'm giving a quick rundown of all the factions for Total War Warhammer 2. Faction variety is what makes Total War Warhammer multiplayer unique and special. Every faction has a unique roster and playstyle. However, it can be daunting for new players to learn. Even experienced players find it difficult to switch from their mains or to learn certain matchups. Let's get a quick look at each faction, their strengths and weaknesses, and possible playstyles. Scurrying away first, we have the Skaven, an actual horde of rats. They come with high numbers and pretty terrible leadership. They have pretty fast infantry, but do lack any proper cavalry or mobility, instead relying on excellent missiles, monsters, and chariots. They also have an advantage in their unique only lores that allow for good summoning, and all their characters are pretty cost effective for the most part. As you would imagine, their playstyles rely on artillery and spread. You can also win through attrition by endless summons and endless numbers. They also have some pretty mean rush builds as well. For newer players, they are pretty tough to learn, as you'll have to manage lots of routing units and also learn targeting priority. Stomping after the rats, we have the Lizardmen, dinos riding dinos with some of the best monsters in the game, supported by decent infantry, with mixed speed and leadership, Saurus having high leadership and low speed with decent armor, Skinks having much lower armor but higher speed and lower leadership. They have good missiles, with all of them having either poison or fire damage. Because of their Skinks, they can definitely field a decent horde-style army. They have excellent magic, with top-tier casters like Mazdamundi and the Slann. They have a number of playstyles, can bump and grind in an attrition-style fight, rush you with monsters, or kite with those poison missiles. They are an easier faction to learn for beginners. Mostly you'll need matchup-specific knowledge, and because of some of the slow speed, you will need to learn positioning and timing as well. To round out the animal people, we've got the Beastmen, a horde of wild beasts, one of the fastest factions across the board, and has one of the best vanguard selections as well. They have excellent summons with a variety of monsters. However, they do have relatively low armor and leadership across the board, with a couple exceptions. You have excellent light cavalry and chariots. They do have a pretty bad lord selection though, with no heavy cavalry and relatively limited magic, although they do have a very powerful, unique lore of magic. Lore of Wild. Their playstyles, obviously with their fast speed, play into more of a rush. You can also do a hit and run, and with the Cygor do a bit of an artillery spread kind of hybrid style build. All Chaos factions rush, but Beastmen have the best missile options. They are pretty tough for beginners to learn because of that speed and low leadership, very much relying on terrain more so than any other faction, and you'll also need to learn how to control mobile, fast-moving units. To hunt the beasts come the Northmen, Norsca, with marauders and monsters, some of the best monsters in the game. They also have pretty good speed across the board, and many of their units also have frostbite, which is a significant slow. They have decent infantry with mixed armor, not the best, but they do have the worst lord selection in the game, with only 3 lord types as of the recording of this video. No heavy cavalry whatsoever or artillery, however they do have decent light cavalry and mobility, a good magic selection with a Famir Balefiend, who's sort of like a monstrous infantry caster, relatively unique. Obviously their playstyles with no artillery, relatively limited missiles, are definitely more of a rush faction, although they can do some hit and run style builds as well. They are a bit tough for beginners to learn, easier than Beastmen, but again you will need to learn how to manage your mobility well, and also get some matchup specific knowledge. The Ever-Chosen, of course, leads the Warriors of Chaos, and this is the heavy Chaos faction, with excellent infantry and monsters. They've got decent light cavalry also, good heavy cavalry and chariots, limited missiles, even more so than Norsca, and they're also relatively expensive across the board in terms of their roster. They have a good magic selection though. Their casters tend to be relatively tanky, more expensive, but with better stats than many other factions' casters. Like the other Chaos factions, they play more into a rush style. However, with the Hellcan, you can also do some artillery spread style builds and some hit and run. Of the 3 Chaos factions, they are the easiest to learn. Speaking of villains, moving on to the vampire counts, this is Halloween Town, and it's the Rush Undead faction. Quick aside about Undead. Undead, of course, do not have traditional leadership. Instead of running away, they crumble, which is to say that they take a tiny trickle of damage that, as of the recording of this video, is almost completely unimpactful. What this means is that their rosters are, by and large, essentially unbreakable. Not quite. You can get their units to disintegrate, in which case they'll disappear very quickly, but it's pretty hard to do. And again, the crumbling damage is very low, so as a result, most Undead factions across the board have pretty low stats, but also rely on some healing. The vampire counts have no missile units whatsoever and have the most healing of any of the Undead factions. They have excellent melee infantry, cool magic chariots as well, but there's a few support chariots and a few more damage-focused chariots. They have excellent heavy cavalry with some of the best in the game and good monsters as well. They also have access to the best lore of magic, lore of vampires. As for their playstyles, you can guess with the lack of missile units, they play pretty much always a rush-style build, although they can go a number of different ways there in that they can play more of an attrition grind or more of a traditional just straight-up rush. They are one of the easier factions to learn. You will need to learn how to disrupt missile units and get your timing correct, but the lack of routing units and controlling your own missile units means that you'll have to learn less concepts overall, and they are relatively forgiving as well. If you like vampires, but you love the smell of gunpowder even more, then maybe the Vampire Coast is for you. They've got zombie pirates, and they are the missile undead faction, so the counts are very much a rush faction. Coast instead, while they do have some similar abilities and a handful of similar units, that's pretty much where the similarities stop. The Coast are very much a missile-oriented faction, with lots and lots of numbers of missiles and really excellent damage. They've got pretty decent monsters. Their infantry is pretty terrible though, with either high or very low numbers. They're generally very slow. They have a couple of fast units, but no real cavalry or chariots to speak of. Instead, again, relying on those missile units and artillery. They do have, again, the best lore of magic in the game with lore of vampires, along with their own unique lore, lore of deeps, which is definitely nothing to sneeze at. They can play into rush-style builds, although they favor more of the artillery camp-style build with lots of missile units, and of course they can grind you down through attrition as well. They are a bit of an easier faction to learn, although you do need to be careful not to pick up too many bad habits, and also you'll need to learn targeting priority. If you like undead but you hate vampires, then maybe the Tomb Kings are for you. They are totally not vampires. Instead, they're mummies and skeletons. And as for the undead factions, they're the most well-balanced of the three. They've got a reasonably well-rounded roster, only lacking really in traditional heavy cavalry, but they make up for that with excellent monsters and excellent chariots. They do have less healing than other undead, notably lacking lore of vampires. However, they do have their own unique lore, lore of Negakara, that provides a little bit of healing and some other very powerful spells. As for playstyles, they can pretty much do it all with a very flexible roster, and they are one of the easiest factions, if not the easiest faction to learn, in my opinion, because of that flexibility. The fact that they're relatively forgiving with their, their big armored tanky monsters. Really, you'll just need to learn the fundamentals of Total War. Positioning really being one of the keys there, but just general matchup knowledge as well. Tomb Kings, again, is the faction that I would probably most recommend for new players. If you want people who are still alive, you can take the Empire. So this is the Swiss Army Knife faction, the true, well-rounded, jack-of-all-trades, master-of-none faction. Although they do lack monsters almost entirely, they make up for that with excellent heavy cavalry and missiles, and their units generally tend to be very cost-effective. They do have the best variety of magic as well, and an excellent hero selection. They can pretty much play into all play styles, similar to the Tomb Kings, although because they're not undead, they are a bit less forgiving for newer players. They'll be a bit tougher to pick up. Again, though, you just need to mostly learn the fundamentals of Total War, really learning the matchups as well. Empire, because they have a pretty specialized army, you will need to get some good knowledge of those matchups. On a more chivalrous note, we have Bretonnia. Knights and peasants with some of the best heavy cavalry in the game, not quite as well rounded as the Empire, with cheap poor infantry and decent missiles. They lack monsters even more so than the Empire. However, again, the best heavy cavalry in the game. They also have a relatively limited selection of magic, but with some particularly powerful casters, and of course, they have access to Lore of Life as well, which is always nice. As for their playstyles, they can do a bit of hit and run, a bit of attrition, they can rush with mass cav, or do a bit of artillery spread with their trebuchets, although they won't stand up in a straight-up shootout with the faction like Vampire Coast. They are pretty tough to learn though, as again, you'll need your mobility and cav micro on point, and you'll also need to manage lots of routing peasants. If you don't like manure and beards, beers, and bellies are your thing, maybe the dwarfs are for you. They are the bros on their own two legs, excellent infantry, high armor, and leadership, and some of the best missiles in the game. However, they have no cav to speak of. They're the slowest faction in the game across the board, with only a handful of fast-moving units, mostly relying on entirely on infantry, artillery, and foot skirmishers. No monsters. They also have no magic, but compensate with some nice support abilities and are magic resistant across the board. Again, only foot lords and heroes as well. Their playstyle obviously would be artillery camp style then, although they can definitely rush, especially with some notable all-Vanguard builds. And they can, with that high melee defense and armor, definitely grind in an attrition fight as well. They are decent for new players to learn, although like with the Vampire Coast, you'll need to make sure you don't pick up too many bad habits and make sure to learn target priority as well. Their mortal enemies come next, the Greenskins. Orcs, goblins, and more, a rocking good time. They have low leadership, mostly across the board, but do a lot of damage. They have some of the best light cavalry in the game, but pretty poor heavy cavalry, decently well-rounded roster across the board with pretty good infantry, even I would say excellent infantry, and good monsters as well. They don't have the best lord or hero selection, but they can definitely field a lot of numbers with probably, I would say, the second best horde faction in the game. They are also competing for one of the best Vanguard factions as well, with tons and tons of options for Vanguard. They only have 2 lores of magic, both unique to them, plus Lore of Death with a specific legendary lord. The unique lores are very powerful though, and synergize well with Greenskins roster. They can pretty much do just about every style, although they do struggle somewhat in an attrition fight due to lack of healing and leadership. They are pretty tough for new players to learn, although certain styles, certainly with the rush builds, they can be a little bit easier, but you will need to learn your matchups relatively well and also learn to manage routing units, especially the goblins. Now to something a bit more civilized, we've got the High Elves. So let's quickly touch on some general characteristics of elves that apply to all 3 of the elvish factions. Beyond being generally untrustworthy, elves have high stats and leadership but low HP pretty much across the board. The High Elves themselves are the most balanced of the Fey folk. They have pretty good armor across the board, but they do have the most expensive roster in the game as well, on average. They do have 2 of the best casters though, with Teclis and Ilario, and some of the strongest flying monsters in the game also. And again, a reasonably well-rounded roster with decent artillery, infantry, cavalry, and skirmishers. If they're too clean for you, maybe you want the emo ones, the Dark Elves. They are the more offensively focused Fey folk. They do have lower range on most of their missiles, but compensate with armor piercing over the High Elves. They've got pretty good monsters and a good magic selection as well, with a unique lore, notably for a couple of very powerful legendary lords, Malekith and Marathi. They can pretty much play into any playstyle. They are a bit tougher to learn, I would say. I guess this could probably apply to all 3 of the elf factions. By their nature, elves, because of the low HP, aren't super forgiving for mistakes, so they can be tough to learn. You'll definitely need to know your matchup knowledge and know how to choose the right engagements when playing as elves. If the edgy Dark Elves are too much for you and you want to go all the way to the opposite end of the spectrum, we will finish things off with the Wood Elves. So they are the skirmish-focused elves, the second best missile faction in the game in my opinion, and like the Beastmen, they are very fast and very light with only a handful of high armor units. They tend to play more into a hit and run or kite style. Obviously, they do have pretty decent monsters as well, which do allow you to do some rush-oriented builds that can definitely catch people off guard, especially with the speed of your advance, being that they have low armor and elves low HP as well. They are one of the toughest factions, if not the toughest faction to learn. You really have to know your matchups, choose only the right engagements, and just generally you need almost all of the skills that we've talked about in this video so far in order to play the Wood Elves effectively. That rounds out all of the factions that I have for you today. Let me know down in the comments below what you thought about this video. I'm going to be doing more new player-focused content in the near future. I'm hoping to do maybe about one of these guides a week, so let me know down in the comments below if that's what you would like. I'm planning to update my overview series and give a more detailed overview over each of these factions. Let me know what you would like me to do first. Thank you very much for watching. If you found this video helpful, be sure to like, share it with a friend, be sure to subscribe for more content, and we'll see you next time.